In 1856, Virginia didn't just have laws, it had a religion of perfection. If you were a woman, you were a vessel, meant to stand tall, bear airs, and glide through ballrooms like a ghost of Southern grace. But what happens when the vessel breaks? For Ellalinina Whitmore, the crack happened at age 8. A snap of the spine, a fall from grace, and a life sentence to a mahogany wheelchair. By 22, she was a ghost in her own home. 12 men had looked at her, calculated her dowry, looked at her useless legs, and walked away. 12 rejections in 4 years. She was damaged goods. Unfit for marriage. A burden to be managed. But her father's solution wasn't a convent or a boarding house. It was something far more radical. Something that would scandalize the planter class and ignite a fire in the heart of the estate. He handed her to the man they called the Brute, a 7-foot-tall blacksmith bound in chains. Society saw a monster and a cripple. They were about to find out how wrong they were. The 1850s in Virginia functioned as a theater of perfection where every woman was expected to perform a role of flawless grace and ornamental utility. For a daughter of the planter class, her body was not her own. It was a vessel for the continuation of a bloodline and a symbol of her father's standing. Ellalinina Whitmore moved through this world as a ghost, a living reminder of what happens when the porcelain cracks and the vessel is deemed broken. Her mahogany wheelchair was more than a medical necessity. It was a visual confession of her perceived failure to meet the demands of Southern womanhood. In a society that worshipped the aesthetic of the steel magnolia, her inability to stand was viewed as a moral and social deficit. The air in the Whitmore estate grew heavy with the silent judgment of a culture that had no use for a mind if the body could not dance. 12 times the doors of the parlor opened to admit suitors who arrived with expectations of a delicate bride and left with the stench of disappointment. These men did not see the sharp intellect that read Greek and Latin or the fierce spirit that survived a spine-shattering fall. They saw a liability, a woman who could not manage a household on her feet or preside over a dinner table with the required poise. Each rejection was a ritual of public shaming, a calculated assessment where her worth was measured against her capacity to produce heirs without complication. The horror of her existence lay in the realization that she was being appraised like livestock, only to be found wanting at every single turn. Her value had plummeted in the marriage market until she was nothing more than a footnote in the ledger of Virginia's elite class. The isolation of the Whitmore estate mirrored the internal exile Ellalinina suffered as she watched the world move past her windows in a blur of lace. While other girls her age were being courted at summer picnics and winter balls, she was confined to the shadows of a library that offered only cold comfort. Her father's distant affection turned into a frantic, desperate anxiety that manifested as a desire to be rid of a burden he could no longer justify. He saw her not as a daughter to be cherished, but as a problem to be solved before his own mortality forced a reckoning with the law. The halls of their home echoed with the footsteps of men who walked away, their boots clicking a rhythm of abandonment that she learned to hum. She was a queen of a hollow empire, ruling over rooms filled with French chandeliers and the bitter dust of broken promises. Society's cruelty was not merely in the rejection itself, but in the insidious rumors that began to rot her reputation from the inside out like a blight. Whispers traveled through the Piedmont region, suggesting that her broken spine had surely withered her womb, branding her as fundamentally and biologically unfit. It did not matter what the doctors in Philadelphia said about her health. In the court of public opinion, a woman who could not walk was a woman who could not provide. This was the true horror of the era. A woman's entire humanity was reduced to her physical utility and her ability to serve a husband's legacy. She became a plague carrier of misfortune, a girl whose very presence suggested that the Whitmore luck had finally run dry and turned to stone. The weight of these stairs felt heavier than the iron wheels of her chair, pinning her to a floor she could never hope to leave. Every social function she was excluded from was a brick in a wall that the Virginia planter class built to keep the damaged away from the pure. The cruelty was polite, wrapped in silk and delivered with a bow, but it cut deeper than any physical lash ever could have managed to do. Men like Thomas Aldrich and James Morrison were the architects of her despair, using their privilege to define her limits before she could even speak. They wanted a wife who was a decorative asset, a silent partner who would stand by their side to validate their own masculine power and social grip. To them, Ella Lenina was a glitch in the system, a reminder of the fragility of their gilded world that they preferred to ignore or push aside. Her life was a series of closed doors and averted eyes, a long descent into a silence that felt as permanent as the injury to her back. By the time the winter of 1855 bled into the spring of 1856, Ella Lenina had begun to believe the lie that she was truly and utterly worthless. She looked in the mirror and saw a woman who was unmarriageable, a term that carried the weight of a death sentence in the mid-19th century. Her education, once a source of pride, now felt like a cruel joke, a set of tools for a life she was never going to be allowed to lead. The architectural beauty of the South, with its columns and its symmetry, felt like a mockery of her own crooked and seated reality. She was waiting for a miracle or a catastrophe, something to break the cycle of rejections that had stripped her of her dignity and her name. Little did she know that the horror of being branded unfit was about to collide with a radical act of desperation from her father. The stage was set for a transformation that would turn the broken girl into a woman of fire and forged iron. The Colonel stood in the center of his mahogany study, a man who had exhausted the traditional currency of his world. For 4 years, he had attempted to trade his daughter's hand for the security of a white husband, but the market of Virginia's elite had soundly rejected his offerings. Now, driven by a cold and desperate pragmatism, he turned his gaze away from the grand ballrooms and toward the grit of the plantation's industrial heart. He summoned Ella Lenina not to offer another suitor's name, but to announce a transaction that defied every sacred boundary of the Southern social order. The radical nature of his decision was a silent admission that his daughter was no longer a person in his eyes, but a liability. He would settle her future not with a contract of marriage, but with a transfer of custody to a man's society called property. The air in the room grew thin as he prepared to bridge the impossible gap between the manor and the forge. "I am giving you to Josiah," he declared, the words dropping like heavy stones into the quiet stillness of the afternoon. To Ella Lenina, the sentence felt like a physical blow, a final stripping away of her remaining dignity as a white woman of status. Josiah was the blacksmith, a man of such immense physical presence that his very existence was a source of whispered terror among the neighbors. He was a man who moved through the estate with the quiet power of a thunderstorm, his hands stained with the soot of 1,000 fires. By placing his daughter in the care of an enslaved man, the Colonel was effectively excommunicating her from the white world she had failed to serve. This was the radical exchange, a father's desperate gamble to buy a protector for a daughter he believed was otherwise entirely defenseless. He was bypassing the laws of men to invoke a primitive, functional logic of survival that ignored the stains of scandal. The logic behind the Colonel's move was as sharp and as pitiless as a razor, carved from a lifetime of managing cattle and land. He knew that after his death, the estate would pass to male relatives who viewed Ella Lenina as a parasite to be discarded or hidden. He needed a guardian who was physically capable of moving her, mentally sharp enough to manage her needs, and legally bound to the land. In his twisted calculation, a white husband could abandon her, but an enslaved man was a permanent fixture, an anchor in the shifting tides. He looked at Josiah and saw a tool of absolute loyalty, a man whose strength surpassed any 3 suitors who had previously sat in his parlor. The horror of the exchange lay in its cold efficiency, treating a human life as a piece of equipment to be maintained. He was not looking for a son-in-law. He was looking for a high-functioning sentinel to stand watch over his greatest failure. Evelynina's reaction was a mixture of visceral terror and a deep, agonizing sense of betrayal that burned hotter than any forge fire could. She was being handed over like a piece of inherited furniture, an object to be moved from one room to another at a master's whim. The irony was suffocating. Her father claimed he was protecting her, yet he was subjecting her to the ultimate social death. To be given to a slave was to be branded as something less than a lady, a woman whose worth had bottomed out completely. She looked at her father and saw a stranger, a man who had finally surrendered to the darkness of his own obsessive anxieties. The social norms of 1856 Virginia were being torn apart in that study, leaving her standing on the precipice of a terrifying and unknown life. She was a pawn in a game of survival where the rules were being written in the soot of the blacksmith's shop. Josiah himself was summoned to the house, his massive frame forced to duck beneath the ornate lintels that had been built for smaller, softer men. He stood before the colonel not as a willing participant, but as a man receiving a command that carried the weight of a life sentence. His presence in the parlor was a visual contradiction, a mountain of dark muscle amidst the delicate French silks and the polished silver trays. He did not look at Evelynina, keeping his eyes fixed on the floorboards as the colonel outlined the terms of this bizarre and forbidden union. He was to be her husband in name, her carrier in deed, and her shield against a world that would surely turn its back. The silence that followed the colonel's instructions was thick with the unsaid, a heavy curtain draped over the lives of 2 discarded souls. They were being tethered together by a rope of desperation, 2 people who had been defined by what they lacked rather than who they were. The transition began on the 1st of April, a date that felt like a cruel joke played by a fate that had long since abandoned mercy. Josiah moved his meager belongings into a room adjacent to Evelynina's, a proximity that would have triggered a lynch mob had it been discovered by the neighbors. The colonel stood as the sole witness and architect of this shadow marriage, reading Bible verses into an empty room as if to sanctify the sin. He commanded the household staff to respect the arrangement, effectively creating an island of madness within the borders of the Whitmore estate's 5,000 acres. Evelynina watched from her chair, feeling the weight of her new reality settle over her like a shroud that refused to be lifted. The radical exchange was complete. The daughter of the house was now the charge of the forge, and the brute was now her king. Their lives were now irrevocably fused, 2 broken pieces of a dying system trying to find a way to exist in the dark. The legend of the man called the brute was a shadow that loomed over the Whitmore estate, fueled by whispers of his terrifying physical power. At 7 feet tall, Josiah was a mountain of obsidian muscle whose hands were said to be capable of snapping iron bars as if they were dry twigs. The white overseers looked at him with a mixture of predatory fascination and deep-seated fear, seeing only a primal force that required constant, heavy chains. To the planter class, he was a biological anomaly, a creature born for the singular purpose of back-breaking labor and silent, mindless obedience. They created a myth around him to justify their own cruelty, reducing a complex man to a caricature of animalistic strength and raw, untamed violence. He lived in the public eye as a monster, a silent giant who moved through the tobacco fields with the weight of a god. Yet, behind the furnace of the blacksmith shop, the man the world called a beast was secretly cultivating a very different kind of power. When Evelynina was first left alone with the giant, she expected the rough edges of a savage, but she found instead a profound, echoing silence. Josiah did not speak with the booming roar of a monster. His voice was a low, resonant hum that vibrated with a startling and unexpected gentleness. As he moved her wheelchair, his touch was as light as a summer breeze, showing a hyper-awareness of her fragility that her own father lacked. He navigated the narrow hallways of the manor with a grace that contradicted his massive frame, ducking beneath the lintels with a practiced, humble dignity. The horror of the brute began to dissolve the moment he looked at her, not with lust or aggression, but with a deep, soulful recognition. She realized then that his size was a cage just as restrictive as her wheelchair, a physical trap that kept the world from seeing his heart. The subversion of his character began in those quiet moments where the fearsome blacksmith became the most tender of all her earthly guardians. The true revelation occurred in the dim light of the library, where the man society called property revealed himself to be a scholar of the shadows. Josiah had spent years stealing moments of literacy, teaching himself to read by the flickering orange glow of the forge and the light of a moon. He did not just recognize letters. He understood the weight of words, the rhythm of poetry, and the complex philosophical structures of the ancient world. When he spoke of Shakespeare's The Tempest, he did not recite the lines like a parrot, but analyzed Caliban with the insight of a philosopher. He saw himself in the monster of the island, a man whose humanity was denied by a master who claimed to be a bringer of civilization. Elalina watched in awe as this 7-foot blacksmith deconstructed the very pillars of the society that had sought to bury them both in ignorance. The brute was a mask he wore for survival, a thick layer of soot and muscle hiding a mind that was sharper than a surgeon's steel. Their conversations became a secret rebellion against a world that insisted they were both fundamentally incapable of having a voice or a future. Josiah spoke of the stars and the movement of the heavens with a poetic curiosity that made the library walls seem to expand into the infinite. He possessed a patchy but brilliant education, fueled by a hunger for knowledge that would have shamed the university-bred men who had previously rejected her. For the first time in her life, Elalina found an intellectual equal who did not treat her learning as a mere novelty or a parlor trick. They traded ideas like contraband, building a bridge of shared logic over the gaping chasm of the racial and social hierarchies that surrounded them. Josiah's literacy was his ultimate act of defiance, a quiet war waged against the system that declared his brain to be a secondary organ. He was a man who lived in a world of books, even while his hands were busy shaping the tools of his own captivity. As the weeks passed, the physical intimidation of his height transformed into a sense of absolute security that Elalina had never known in her life. She stopped seeing the scarred hands of a laborer and started seeing the hands of a creator who could fashion beauty from the rawest of materials. Josiah's gentleness was not a sign of weakness, but the ultimate expression of a self-control that allowed him to exist in a hostile land. He walked with the burden of 1,000 years of history, yet he found the energy to lift her spirits with a well-placed line of verse. The horror storytelling tone of their meeting had shifted into a narrative of profound and quiet beauty, where the monster turned out to be the saint. He was a man who had been whipped for mistakes he did not make, yet he carried no bitterness in the way he tended to her needs. The subversion was complete. The most dangerous man on the estate was the only one who truly understood the meaning of a soul. By the time the autumn leaves began to fall, the name, the Brute, felt like a blasphemy to Elalina's ears, a lie told by the blind and the cruel. She saw the way he looked at the world with a mixture of sorrow and hope, a man who knew he was a king in a world that saw him as an ox. Their relationship was built on the ruins of the identity society had forced upon them, creating something new and powerful in the wreckage. Josiah had become her eyes and her legs, but more importantly, he had become the mirror in which she finally saw her own true worth. The radical exchange had backfired on the colonel, for instead of providing a mindless guard, he had given his daughter a partner in revolution. They were two outcasts who had discovered that the labels of the world were nothing more than smoke and mirrors designed to keep the powerful in place. The blacksmith and the girl in the chair were now a singular force, waiting for the moment they could finally break their chains. The forge became a sanctuary where the traditional roles of master and servant were consumed by the heat of the glowing coals. Ella Lenina watched Josiah work with a new intensity, fascinated by the way his massive frame moved in a rhythmic dance with the fire. For years, she had been told that her body was a fragile vessel, a broken thing that must be shielded from the rigors of physical exertion. Now, the roar of the bellows and the orange light of the furnace offered a different kind of sermon on the nature of strength. She realized that while her legs were stationary, her arms and her will were hungry for the weight of a hammer and the resistance of iron. The forge was not just a place of labor for her. It was a laboratory of transformation where her identity as a victim could be melted down. Under Josiah's watchful and encouraging eye, she prepared to step into a heat that would forge a new version of herself. The first time she took the hammer in her hand, the weight of the tool felt like an impossible burden against her delicate skin. Josiah did not pity her or tell her the task was too heavy. He simply guided her grip and showed her the angle of the strike. He placed a small piece of glowing iron on the anvil, a scrap of metal that would become her first testament to her own physical agency. The heat radiating from the forge felt like a baptism, washing away the stagnant air of the library and the sterile scent of the manor. When she swung the hammer, the vibration traveled up her arms and deep into her chest, a pulse of power she had never felt before. It was a clumsy strike, barely making an impression on the stubborn metal, but it was the first time in 14 years she had acted upon the world. She was no longer just an observer of life. She was a participant in the violent, beautiful art of creation. Day after day, the crippled Whitmore girl vanished beneath a layer of soot and a newfound layer of calloused working muscle. She learned to read the color of the heat, knowing exactly when the iron was soft enough to yield and when it had turned too brittle. Josiah taught her that strength was not found in the legs, but in the leverage of the back and the unwavering focus of the mind. She began to shape small hooks and simple tools, her dexterity returning as her hands grew accustomed to the rough handle of the forging tools. The physical pain in her shoulders was a welcome change from the emotional ache of her long isolation in the big house. Every successful weld was a small victory against the men who had looked at her and saw only a useless, decorative burden. She was reclaiming her body one strike at a time, finding a rugged grace in the sparks that flew from her anvil. The soot that stained her face was a badge of honor that she wore with a defiance that would have horrified the local gentry. She no longer cared if her hands were soft or if her complexion remained pale beneath the shade of a silken parasol. In the forge, the wheelchair was not a sign of weakness, but a stable platform from which she could command the elements. Josiah treated her as an apprentice, a fellow artisan whose contributions to the shop were becoming as valuable as his own massive efforts. They worked in a silent, synchronized harmony, the ringing of their hammers creating a melody of resistance against the world outside. The forge had become a space where the social hierarchy of 1856 Virginia was rendered entirely irrelevant by the laws of physics. She was discovering that while society could limit her movement, it could never limit the capacity of her spirit to shape its own destiny. This physical reclamation served as a powerful revenge against a culture that had written her off as a tragic and static figure. Every piece of iron she bent was a symbolic strike against the 12 men who had found her unworthy of a life of purpose. She was proving that a woman in a chair could be more productive and more vital than any belle standing in a ballroom. The horror of her situation had been replaced by a gritty, industrial empowerment that thrived in the smoke and the shadows of the shop. Josiah watched her progress with a pride that was deeper than any affection she had ever received from her distant, calculating father. They were building a legacy of steel, creating objects that would outlast the fragile social structures that sought to keep them in their places. The forge had given her a voice that didn't need words, a voice that rang out with every heavy blow of the hammer. By the end of the summer, Ellalinina Whitmore had become a woman who understood the true value of heat, pressure, and time. She had transformed from a piece of damaged goods into a creator of functional beauty, a transformation that was as radical as the marriage itself. The forge was the anvil upon which her new life was being hammered into a shape that was both resilient and undeniably strong. She looked at her scarred, soot-stained hands and saw a beauty that was far more authentic than the polished vanity of her peers. Josiah had given her more than protection. He had given her the tools to build her own sense of self-worth from the ground up. They were no longer just an enslaved man and a disabled woman. They were two masters of the flame, united by the iron they forged together. The world still saw them as broken, but in the heat of the shop they knew they were finally whole. The winter solstice of 1856 brought a chilling silence to the Piedmont as the secret world of the library and forge finally met its reckoning. For months, Ellalinina and Josiah had existed in a state of grace that the laws of Virginia had never intended for them to possess. They had moved beyond the roles of protector and ward, finding a profound and forbidden intimacy that flourished in the shadows of the Colonel's desperate plan. It was not merely an alliance of convenience, but a deep, intellectual and physical rebellion that sought to reclaim their stolen humanity. They sat together in the library, the glow of the firelight dancing across the leather-bound books that had become their common language. Their love was a quiet storm, a revolutionary force that threatened to level the pillars of the Whitmore estate and everything it represented. In that room, they were no longer a master's daughter and a piece of property, but two souls bound by an unbreakable bond. The discovery came with a sudden, violent swing of the study door, shattering the fragile peace they had spent months carefully constructing. The Colonel stood in the threshold, his face a mask of pale fury as he witnessed a sight that defied the very foundations of his reality. He saw his daughter's hand resting in Josiah's massive palm, an act of affection that transcended the functional boundaries he had originally set. To the Colonel, the arrangement was a matter of survival and logistics, never a matter of the heart or a shared future. The horror in his eyes was not just for the scandal, but for the loss of control over the resources he had attempted to manage. He saw the rebellion for what it was, a total rejection of the racial and social hierarchies that kept his world in orbit. The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of centuries of law and the immediate threat of a catastrophic social death. Josiah immediately moved to shield Ellalinina, his massive frame a living wall against the tidal wave of his master's cold and simmering indignation. He dropped to his knees, not in submission to the man, but in a tactical attempt to de-escalate the danger threatening the woman he loved. The Colonel's voice was a low, dangerous hiss as he leveled accusations that carried the literal power of life and death in 1856. He spoke of betrayal, of the violation of trust, and of the inherent beastliness he now claimed to see in the man he once trusted. Every word was designed to strip away the dignity Josiah had worked so hard to cultivate in the privacy of their shared hours. Yet, as the insults rained down, Josiah remained steadfast, his eyes meeting Ellalinina's with a silent promise of protection that no lash could ever break. The rebellion had moved from the quiet forge into the light of day, and there was no path leading back to the safety of the dark. Ellalinina found a voice she had forged in the heat of the blacksmith shop, a voice that rang out with the clarity of struck iron. She did not cower or plead for forgiveness, but looked her father in the eye with a gaze that was both ancient and entirely new. She claimed her love for Josiah as the first truly independent choice she had ever made in a life defined by the choices of men. She reminded the colonel that he was the one who had discarded her, who had branded her unfit, and traded her away to a stranger. If the world saw her as damaged and Josiah as property, then they were free to build a world of their own design within that wreckage. Her father's shock turned to a hollow kind of grief as he realized he no longer possessed the power to command her heart. She was standing up in the only way that mattered, asserting a sovereignty over her own life that the law had never meant to grant. The fallout of their defiance was a cold war fought within the walls of the great house, where every meal was a ritual of silent, suffocating tension. The colonel could not easily undo what he had done without inviting the very scandal he had spent his entire life trying to avoid at all costs. He was trapped by his own radical solution, forced to watch as the two people he had marginalized became the center of their own universe. Josiah continued his duties with a grim, silent efficiency, but the air between him and the colonel was now thick with the scent of an impending explosion. The rebellion had shifted the power dynamics of the estate, turning the brute and the cripple into the most formidable forces on the 5,000 acres. They were preparing for an ultimate departure, knowing that Virginia could never hold the expansive reality of the love they had forged in the fire. Their eyes were fixed on the horizon, toward a future that was as uncertain as it was absolutely necessary for their survival. Their story ends not with a surrender to the status quo, but with a leap into the unknown that defined the true spirit of their resistance. They had proven that the labels of unmarriageable and property were nothing more than lies meant to keep the human spirit in a state of permanent subjection. By finding each other, they had found the strength to reject a society that saw only their limitations and ignored their profound, glowing potential. The Whitmore estate remained a monument to a dying era, but Ellalinina and Josiah were moving toward a light that the plantation could never extinguish. They had turned a horror story of rejection into an epic of revenge through the simple, radical act of choosing to love one another. As they prepared to leave the Piedmont behind, they carried with them the tools of the forge and the wisdom of the library. They were the architects of their own liberation, two discarded people who had become the masters of a destiny they had hammered out of the cold, hard iron of their lives.